You know, nobody has done more for Christianity. Nobody has done more for religion of all type than me.
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm your co-host, Dean Detloff.
And I'm your co-host, Matt Burnka.
It's Easter. He really did it. He did it indeed. He did it again. He resurrected from the dead. You thought he could keep him in there, but you couldn't. He got out. They went looking for him. They couldn't find him where he was supposed to be. They freaked out about it, but guess what? He was the gardener the whole time. Jesus is back, better than ever, ready to wander around before he gets beamed up to heaven. Matt, how was your Easter?
Oh, it was great. I got up really early so I could play video games with you, which was fun. And then I don't know, sat around for a little bit. And then I went to church and had an Easter dinner, and we had an Easter egg hunt, and I don't know, just all the regular Easter stuff. We did it. Yeah, how was yours?
Pretty good. I went to mass, and that was fine. And it's Easter around the city, so some things are open, some things are not. Always a weird kind of event to have a Christian holiday in a secularizing society, but overall, pretty good.
Yeah.
Did you get any especially interesting eggs?
No. Nope, not really at all. Just chocolate eggs, just regular chocolate eggs filled with all of the best Scottish and British treats. We got haggis in these eggs. We got beans in these eggs. Just the normal stuff, you know?
Yeah, normal, regular, average stuff. The kind of monstrosities you can only get under direct rule of the monarchy. I guess indirect
That's
rule
right.
in Scotland. Yeah, well, anyway, it is Easter, and Jesus is still the reason for the season, no matter what that secular bunny might say. And we're here to talk about that, to talk about Christianity and the weird things that Jesus did introduce into our world, for better and for worse. This week, we're talking about a specific mutation of Christianity. I think since Trump was elected, we've been going back and forth on kind of, I don't know, our usual shtick of like talking about something we read or some idea we're batting around, and then also trying to like track all the bizarre stuff that's been going on. And I thought it would be fun, interesting, good, helpful, I don't know, to talk through a particular event related to the Trump administration. And that is an executive order that was signed in February about rooting out anti-Christian bias in the government. And it is very interesting, very weird for all kinds of reasons. But it just seems like an appropriate Easter topic because Jesus is risen. He's risen indeed. And here's a bunch of people who do control the government of the richest, most powerful, most violent country in the world. And they're ready to root out all the people who don't like that guy, or so they say. And Matt, I just want to know how that lands with you.
It's such a funny executive order. For a lot of reasons. It does require Marco Rubio asking you to tattle on your fellow employees, which I think is very silly. It's all such a silly thing to think because the anti-Christian bias they're talking about is kind of just made up. It is like I don't know, we'll maybe get to it later on, some of the psychoanalysis that I think is happening here, some of the weird mental constructions happening here, but this is definitely like just made up stuff that the right can be mad about and sort of expressing grievances about. And I think that's kind of all that it comes to. The anti-Christian bias that they see in the world is really just like, I don't know, they're angry about people who've been arrested for being out of control and doing illegal things at like anti-abortion protests and stuff like that. But it is weird because in a certain sense, there is a lot of anti-Christian bias in the US, just like not a type that's actually discernible to either liberals or conservatives. Whenever I think about this in general, I always think about Jessica Reznicek, and she's a water defender who sabotaged a pipeline. And she was branded a homegrown terrorist. Like she's a domestic terrorist, and she's in jail for the foreseeable future. But it's wild because like she did that for Christian reasons. And isn't that anti-Christian bias to say that she should be in jail forever for doing something that's an expression of her faith? I mean, I think so. But that's not what they're talking about, right? So there's this kind of weird thing going on here where the Trump regime is using their powers of executive order to really set up and define like what Christian counts as, like what Christian action counts as, and it's like nothing good. So a lot of weird kind of threads to pull on in this one.
Yeah, exactly. There are a lot of weird threads to pull on in it. And one thing that really made me want to do this is I was reading an article by Judith Butler in the London Review of Books, being a really educated person, reading the LRB. And it's pretty good. It's called, very simply, This Is Wrong. And in it, Judith Butler does this analysis of an executive order that tries to define gender in particular, and then, I don't know, all kinds of bizarre stuff that happens related to that. But they say in the article, there's kind of like, there's just like a barrage of like a torrent of stuff coming out of the White House. And I think we all know that, right? This is like a strategy of the Trump government. It's the Steve Bannon, like flood the zone with shit strategy. And it is working. It's intimidating. It makes it really hard to like understand what's even going on. And in the midst of that, Judith Butler says, we need to actually take the time to parse this stuff out, even though it feels almost like stupid to do it, or it's kind of absurd to take it that seriously. And they make this comment in particular that I think is helpful. They said, we need forms of public pedagogy that involve reading the executive orders carefully, the better to explain what they're saying and doing with the language they use. What realities do they seek to create and normalize? And I think that that is a really good question. It's a real Judith Butler kind of question. What does language kind of do to the world? How does it organize the world? And obviously, Judith Butler's doing that with respect to gender. But I think for those of us who are invested in Christianity some way or other, it's helpful to see that, to try to like pick apart the ways that the US government is trying to create a certain kind of Christianity, or like double down on what Christianity is, at the expense even of other Christians who are going to suffer as a result of that very kind of defining process. So I figure we could talk through that a little bit as well. And I think the Butler is right that, as absurd as it is to like read this stuff seriously, like if you try to read this executive order, it literally reads like nonsense. It's just bizarre. Yeah, but nevertheless, it's actually helpful to like try to do it in a serious way, because that is the kind of language that's going to shape, legal processes and how people understand things like our own faith in the future and now. So I thought we could do some of that in this episode. And maybe to start off the bat, I could say there are kind of two big pieces to the executive order. One is, as you said, Matt, a kind of like list of, I don't know, grievances against the Biden administration for what they call anti-Christian. They call it actually the anti-Christian weaponization of government. So we could talk through that and what they mean by that. And then the second piece is the establishment of a task force to eradicate anti-Christian bias in the government. So there's this kind of reckoning with what they say was anti-Christian bias under Biden. So we could talk through that bit. And then there's also this kind of creation of a government apparatus designed to, I guess this is kind of the constructive move in some ways, to police the boundaries of what Christianity is.
Yeah, that sounds good. Well, let's start off with the first one and talk about the anti-Christian weaponization of the government. Well, what's that one? What's that piece of it?
Yeah, all right. So they talk in this executive order about how the Biden administration was really kind of hounding Christians. And of course, as we've talked about on the show in the past, this is absurd in part because the Biden administration is another kind of Christian nationalism, just a different sort. So, whatever. It's Christians doing, I don't know, political stuff with respect to other people who happen to be Christians. But the way that they sort of understand the weaponization of anti-Christianity under Biden is by taking a few particular cases, and maybe it'd be helpful to even identify what those are, because I think that gets us into the neighborhood of figuring out what they're so upset about. So one example that they talk about is the bringing of federal criminal charges against about 24, they say. This is how they put it: peaceful pro-life Christians for praying and demonstrating outside abortion facilities. And they kind of list some of those people. and Trump apparently pardoned all those folks. But this, the fact that the Biden administration, or the Department of Justice brought those cases forward is cited as an example of anti-Christian bias. Another is the FBI memorandum looking at radical traditionalist Catholics as a form of domestic terrorism. And then maybe the last example they give is the establishment of the Trans Day of Visibility in 2024 on March 31st, which so happened to land on Easter. And they connect that with the Department of Education trying to take away religious liberty protections, they say, for faith-based organizations that don't agree with, prejudice against trans people. So those are the big three. So disciplining anti-abortion activists, the FBI singling out tradcaths, and then lastly, the attempt to, say that it should be illegal to discriminate against trans people, even if you're a Christian. Those are the three big items. What do you think, Matt? Are we living in a time, or have we finally been delivered from an anti-Christian assault under the Joe Biden administration?
Yeah, well, if that's the perspective, I think that we need a little bit more anti-Christian weaponization of the government. I think we could use a little more of that actually these days. No, I mean, I think it's this is an expression of the grievances that the right often will bring up, right? It's about abortion, it's about transgender people, whatever. It's just sort of all a facade, I think, and whatever. Donald Trump pardon some of these people, but like, I don't know, he doesn't care about any of this. Like, this is not something that Donald Trump really cares about. This is like a way to point to, to point to real action in the world and be like, look, I'm doing all this great stuff for Christians. And in fact, there are video clips of him talking about this where he's like, I'm the most pro-Christian president now. I'm doing all this great stuff for the Christians. And it's just like, this is nothing. This is not doing anything for Christianity. This is just like playing into more right-wing grievances. This is not anything about Christianity. Like, in fact, just things that people are mad about. more things that the boomers don't like. It's just bizarre, I think. But, it's a tactical executive order that I think is just, he can use it and point to it as a sort of proof in the pudding of he's actually doing stuff out there for Christians.
Right. And I think that it's helpful, as Butler says, to figure out exactly what's the language that's being used here and what's the reality that it's trying to create. And for instance, if we take each of these three things apart, and maybe that's the path we should go, I think it helps us to get a sense of both what kind of Christianity is being promoted, but also what kind of Christianity is being denied in that defining process. So, for example, starting with the abortion case. So we did a little digging to figure out exactly what are they referring to on all these items. And this specific story, so I'll read what the executive order says and how they describe it, and then we can talk about the facts, which don't care about your feelings.
How many Pinocchios does this one have? I gotta know.
That's right. So it says the Biden Department of Justice sought to squelch faith in the public sphere or public square by bringing federal criminal charges and obtaining in numerous cases multi-year prison sentences against nearly 24 peaceful pro-life Christians for praying and demonstrating outside abortion facilities. They go on to say some of those people, who they are, and they say they were arrested 18 months after praying and singing hymns outside an abortion facility in Tennessee as part of a politically motivated prosecution campaign by the Biden administration. So that's how the executive order describes it. We looked it up, and you will, dear listener, not be surprised to learn that they were not actually arrested for praying or singing hymns. That's actually not a crime. They were arrested because they had formed a blockade and were physically preventing people from entering the clinic. And, I mean, whatever. Like, there's a conversation to be had about, using particular means to get what you want and all that kind of stuff. You can think whatever you want to think about abortion or direct action or whatever. But I think the fact is the executive order language is trying to frame this in terms of here were some people who were arrested for being Christians. That's the reason they were arrested. Right. And regardless of what we think, that is not the case, right? They were arrested because they were doing something illegal. They were obstructing access to a building. And I think the example you gave earlier of Jessica Reznicek is the right one to contrast with this, right? Because she also did break the law, right? She did something illegal. She sabotaged private property and oil pipeline. And she did that because she's a Christian. But nobody is saying that the Biden administration was persecuting Christians or whatever by refusing to let her out of prison. Or we talked about the Kings Bay Plowshares 7 not too long ago. Those folks too were motivated by their faith, in particular, to trespass on a naval base, and they were sent to prison for that. And that is, nobody's looking at that as a kind of persecution of Christians. And I think that maybe, like, in an interesting way, they could. There's probably like an interesting angle on that. But the point of the executive order is, if you're a conservative Christian in particular, and you break the law, you're just exercising your faith, and you shouldn't be punished for that. But
Right.
nobody would ever extend that same kind of principle in the other direction. And it is an attempt to start kind of putting the boundaries around what Christianity is, and also what legal protections sort of protect you from or protect others from. And I think that it is pretty troubling to sort of see the linguistic move here to just automatically start saying, well, these people were just arrested for praying and singing hymns, when that was definitely not the case.
Mm-hmm. Okay. That is very helpful to kind of shed some light on the situation. Like you said, like what types of reality are being built when we are defining Christianity in X, Y, and Z ways, right? All good stuff. Here are two disparate and completely different thoughts that I think we can maybe consider moving forward. Okay, so first, one thought on the abortion thing. There's a Scotland angle on the story, and since I'm here, I'm going to definitely tell you what it is. So last year in Scotland, there's this law that got passed called the Safe Access Zones Act, and a Scottish Green MSP got it into Parliament, and it was like their project, and they did it. So great job, Scottish Greens. I'm a fan. Anyways, a little bit at least. I guess it would have been around the same time as this executive order was released. JD Vance was also, quote, spreading misinformation about these safe access zones in Scotland, but kind of using the same sort of tactics, and maybe something that will help shed some more light on the whole situation. JD Vance was like speaking at this is at the Munich Security Conference. Man, this was only in February, but it does seem like it was a lifetime ago. It seems crazy. All of this stuff is happening too much. Anyways, JD Vance basically was saying that in Scotland, the Scottish government sent out letters to people who were in these like safe access zones and said that they couldn't pray, not even in their homes. So freedom of speech is being attacked. Christians are being attacked. You can't even pray in your homes in Scotland. But anyways, an interesting thing about that story is that is not true. You can pray in your homes. The only provision here in this in the safe access zones thing is that like there are buffer zones around abortion clinics where people can't protest and try to sort of influence people who are going into the clinics, which seems pretty fair given the severity of the situation. I don't know. Seems like a big deal, and I wouldn't want people yelling at me about it. So anyways, it's not as JD Vance says, but you can see sort of like the rhetoric and the type of world that JD Vance wants to build. It's one where like there are these awful authoritarian governments out there, which is very funny to think of Scotland like that. And they won't let you pray in your own house. Okay, so I think this is like maybe a good addition to the world building. In a way, this is like the executive order is like playing a game of Dungeons and Dragons, where I'm imagining this other world that exists, and I'm just kind of like trying to figure out the rules of the world as we kind of wade into it. And within this world, I'd like to be a hobbit, and I'd like to be a mage, but I'm not any of those things. I'm just a guy on a computer. But I think something interesting to kind of go along with this, though, is that like Christians are no strangers at all to persecution fantasies. This is like what evangelical Christianity is all about. It's always been about this. We've always been like kind of cultivating our persecution fantasies and the organs by which we get them. Like, I don't know, think of all of the popular media from Christians in the last few years. You got God's Not Dead 1, 2, and 3. These are all persecution fantasies. You got if you're a millennial Christian, a horrible thing to be. but you might remember like the DC Talk Jesus Freak book where they'll tell you all about the Columbine shooters and like the persecution that happened, or the persecution fantasy that like sort of sprung out around expressing your faith in a public place, in like a public school, and then being killed for it or something, right? Christians love these types of fantasies because they give them a sense of like moral correctness or something, right? Like they are being persecuted in the world, and that they are being persecuted is proof that like they're doing something right. You know, that's sort of the seed of the persecution fantasy. It gives them a type of like moral credibility because like they're doing something so radical. They're living this life that other people hate, so it must be like something special, right? But this all reminded me, I mean, especially this executive order, this reminded me of something that Tad DeLay said in his book Against What the White Evangelical Wants. And Tad says a lot of things in that book, and some of them are over my head. I'm not smart enough to read them and understand them. But one of the things I am smart enough to understand is I think the stuff about persecution fantasies that evangelicals have. And a point that he makes in that book that I think is pretty powerful is that he says that persecution fantasies are like reverse revenge fantasies. Because like within a persecution fantasy, evangelicals claim to undergo a kind of persecution. But secretly, that's the type of thing that they would love to sort of inflict on other people. There's a certain sense in which like, well, that's just mean-spirited, thinking the worst of evangelicals. But I think this executive order is actually a great example of how this is absolutely true, right? Because it's like Donald Trump is like, oh yeah, Christians are so persecuted, so what we're going to do is do all of the things that we are claiming that people do to Christians back onto non-Christians, right? We're gonna the anti-Christian weaponization of the government. No, we're gonna do the Christian weaponization of the government. It's just right. This is revenge. This is exactly revenge. And what sucks about that is like that is gonna give, I mean, evangelical Christians on the right such a boner. They're gonna love this. Like they're gonna love this so much. But I think that's like part of the world building fantasy that's happening.
Yeah, I think you're right. Also, I think you did stumble on a great article premise, which is Donald Trump as Dungeon Master, and I encourage you to read it. I think it's a really good idea. Yeah, I think also, so if that is an example of maybe a Christian persecution fantasy, like these people are not being persecuted or prosecuted either for being Christians, but for something else, maybe that is a good segue into the second item in the executive order, this kind of FBI memo. So you might remember in 2024, there was this FBI memo that was leaked, and it had sort of, it made clear that the FBI was investigating radical traditional Catholics, the red trad Caths. They're under surveillance. And in this case, the executive order is not wrong to point that out, right? So if the first one is a fantasy, this one is not a fantasy. But it does rest on some other fantastical elements, the way that they describe it. So here's what they say. In 2023, an FBI memorandum asserted that radical traditionalist Catholics were domestic terrorism threats and suggested infiltrating Catholic churches as threat mitigation. This later retracted FBI memorandum cited as support evidence propaganda from highly partisan sources. So they, I guess, don't believe that you can be a radical traditionalist Catholic and also be a domestic terrorist. That's like one kind of interesting linguistic thing going on here, right? These are mutually exclusive categories. But I think it's interesting to actually look at what the memo was saying. And by the way, this is not a not an apologetic for why the FBI is good. But again, just kind of looking at what's really going on here. So the FBI, they did in fact have such a memo, and in it, part of it was related to the arrest of a particular person, and they go on to kind of analyze like the profile of this person. So I'll just read a little bit from that memo. It was reported on in a bunch of places. You can go find it. I'm looking at LaCroix, which is a European Catholic publication that reported on it. They said this. The memo says this. According to an FBI Richmond contact with direct access reporting for the first time, prior to this person who was arrested, prior to their arrest in 2022, they'd been attending the Society of St. Pius X, which is a right-wing schismatic Catholic thing. Technically not even Catholic, I guess, because it is schismatic, but whatever. You get the point. They attended that for approximately 7 months, participating in catechism classes as part of the process to be baptized. Prior to attending, the person stated that he wanted to find a church that was anti-Zionist and anti-progressive. It goes on to say that when the person was arrested, they had 8 Molotov cocktails, 6 smoke bombs, 1 smoke grenade, and firearms components consisting of a complete Glock 19, a lower parts kit, a 3D printed Glock 19 frame, a magazine, and 9mm ammunition found in his possession. They go on to also point out that this person's online activity is like extremely unhinged. It's I don't know, every extremely weird like Catholic Nazi profile you've seen on the internet is what they're talking about, except this person exists in real life. And in the kind of course of the memo, basically they're saying that there's this sort of like emerging trend of far right Catholics that also tie their faith to white supremacy, to the desire for actual violence, both by the state and on the part of para-state actors. And the memo goes on to also kind of look at like the ways that this fits and doesn't fit into other right-wing stuff. And I mean, this is the kind of thing that the FBI does all the time, right? They make reports about potential threats to the public and so on. We talked about a liberation theology memo like that not too long ago, for example, just to give another, I don't know, other side report that they did. But I think the key here that's really interesting is when we compare that text to what the executive order is saying. The impression that the executive order wants to give you is that there's no way that this is real, right? That radical traditionalist Catholics are domestic terrorism threats. And by that, they're trying to get you to think that, like, if your grandma misses the Mass in Latin, the government probably thought she was a radical domestic terrorist.
Right.
And that is not the case, right? Like, the FBI is actually referring to a real existing, small group of people in the U.S. who do have connections also to, like, school shooters and other kinds of shooters in the United States and around the world. There is a far right Christianity that motivates shootings. Just thinking too of like Breivik in Scandinavia, all these examples where Christians are shooting up others. Bissonnette here in Quebec, who shot up the mosque, for example. So the order wants you to imagine that there's no way a traditionalist Catholic would in fact be a domestic terrorist. But the irony is that in fact they are, they can be. And there's a sort of like, there's an extremely troubling refusal to admit that on the part of the government. And it's also a government that obviously would prefer to listen to right-wing Catholics, including, we know, far-right Catholics, than to presume that there's any kind of, actually nefarious threat there or any kind of thing that the public should be protected from. So what the order does linguistically, I guess, to bring this all full circle, is it creates a world in which you couldn't ever be a traditionalist Catholic and be a terrorist. But I think the cynical piece that's underneath this is, everybody knows that there are right-wing Catholic Nazis, fascists, and so on. Like, that's all you have to do is be in the internet for like 10 minutes. And a lot of people in the White House are on the internet for more than 10 minutes. And to know that that kind of person exists in the world. And I think the order is creating a kind of linguistic doublespeak where they don't want you to make that connection. And yet at the same time, that they know that it exists, which is to say it's a kind of refusal to engage that kind of emerging trend of basically fascist paramilitary violence.
Yeah, it's a good shout to point out the word traditional in that particular construction, right? Because like traditional, doesn't mean much. It could be a good thing, it could be a bad thing, who knows? But in that particular construction of like traditional radical Catholic or whatever, it's like, it means something in particular. But yeah, if you're not if you're not a person involved in that discourse, you might not really even flag that as being weird or out of the ordinary. So there's some room to like assert some meaning where other people might not quite understand it. That's a good one. What's the last one again?
The last one is the I guess it's sort of a one main point with 2 subpoints, which is related to trans people. So
Right.
Biden declared March 31st, 2024, Easter Sunday as Transgender Day of Visibility. So that's one thing they really don't like. And I guess they think that Biden is trolling Christians by doing that or something. I don't know. And then the other sub point to this is I'll just read what it says. The Biden Department of Education sought to repeal religious liberty protections for faith-based organizations on college campuses. The Biden Equal Employment Opportunity Commission sought to force Christians to affirm radical transgender ideology against their faith. And the Biden Department of Health and Human Services sought to drive Christians who do not conform to certain beliefs on sexual orientation and gender identity out of the foster care system. So anyway, it's all to say the major point is that, I don't know, the Biden administration says that you have to think that trans people are fine, and they don't like that, and they think that that's an assault on their Christianity.
Ah, right. Okay. Yep. That sucks. That sucks. Yeah, I think when it comes to trans people, you should actually have to treat them like normal people, and you should not be able to discriminate against them when it comes to a job or something. That seems uncontroversial, but I get it. The right doesn't like trans people, and also there's like so few trans people to like defend them, and so few allies to defend them. Then I guess it's just like kind of an easy target. It's so frustrating though, because like trans people, you can be a Christian person and you can be a trans person. They're not mutually exclusive categories. But this is an assertion that maybe they are, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, and not only that, but there are Christians who are not trans and also think that being trans is fine, including the two people on this podcast. So,
Yeah,
it's again that kind of attempt to define a form of Christianity that sees this as mutually exclusive. I think the most kind of embarrassing thing about it is the tacked on bit about the administration saying that Easter Sunday is the transgender day of visibility. Because, like, declaring a particular date as that day is, whatever. It's just a day on the calendar. Easter moves around every single year. Right now, it's not March 31st, for example. And I think that it's such a, like, moment of just absolute whining. Like, that's all it is.
Yeah,
just sort of, like,
totally
being a baby about it. Like,
yeah.
Can you believe that on Easter they said something about the transgender day of visibility? Like, I don't know. There's a certain level at which you're just like, these people are just functionally incapable of growing up and like being adults. And man, that I think is such an important thing, because Christianity does kind of like perpetuate the infantilization of adults, especially evangelicalism, I think. Though not only them, of course, I can say, being a Catholic. but there is this kind of like, affirmation of all your like most baby-brained ideas. And if anybody says anything even remotely like offensive to you, you end up taking that as like an especially direct grievance or something. And it's frustrating that not only does this particular grievance erase the idea that trans people might also like Easter, for example. Or might not, which is also fine. Who cares? But it erases that reality. It also kind of presumes that, they're out to get you in particular if you're a Christian.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. Again, I think this has a lot to do with like perceived persecution and and the fantasies of revenge. I think that the trans day of visibility should actually be on Transfiguration Sunday. I think that would be really cool. Why not? Just throw it in there. I mean, Easter's fine, but I think the Transfiguration might be better. It would be a better day.
Yeah, I think you're probably right about that. So there's one more piece of this. This is also like an aside, I guess. They say that the Biden administration didn't crack down on hostility and vandalism toward Christian churches and places of worship. Whatever. That's what they say. Who knows? I'm not even gonna look that up.
No,
they also
wait,
go
that's
on
so
to say,
stupid. No, that's so stupid. Okay, whatever. The Biden administration didn't crack down on it, but like meanwhile, the Trump administration they march ICE agents into churches.
Yeah, totally.
Like abduct people. Like, what are you talking about? This is insane.
Totally.
This is completely bonkers.
Yeah. The last bit they say here is my administration will not tolerate anti-Christian weaponization of government or unlawful conduct targeting Christians. Okay, that's one thing he's promising you. He goes on to say some stuff about the Constitution, basically. He says, my administration will ensure that any unlawful and improper conduct, policies, or practices that target Christians are identified, terminated, and rectified. So are you feeling safe, Matt, as a Christian?
No, not at all. Not feeling safe. Well, I'm feeling safe because I'm not in that country, so that makes me feel a little bit better. But no, not feeling great about it. I think that sucks.
So that's kind of the, I guess, that's the linguistic world that this executive order is bringing into being, right? It's a world where Christians were under attack under the Biden administration in this like unique escalation of anti-Christian bias. Their Christians were being arrested for praying. They were being arrested for singing hymns. Christians were being directly trolled by the Biden administration. They were being told you're not allowed to hate people. They were, could you imagine such an offensive thing? They were being investigated by the FBI. Your Catholic grandma, she was being investigated by the FBI. That's the world that they want you to believe existed. And now the Trump administration is going to deliver you from that world. But as we've seen, that is a gross misrepresentation of what had happened. And I think it's nevertheless interesting to kind of see that not only is the persecution complex something that, whatever, Christians have identified and now brought into government, it's also the persecution complex is the ground by which Trump is perceived as the liberator, the guy who is canceling all that, stopping all that stuff. So you invent the enemy and then you also slay the enemy, and that kind of makes you the hero in this really bizarre drama.
Yeah, it is interesting. He pardoned some people, and then he's doing this executive order. And then the other like actual sort of boots on the ground piece is that there's a task force to sort of address this within state employees, within State Department employees. Like you said, there's sort of the identification of the problem, but then the slaying of the problem as well. But the slaying of the problem seems kind of made up, and the problem itself seems kind of made up. It just seems like kind of like a lot of made up stuff happening. That will, I think, go a long way politically. Or at least, I don't know. I think it'll go a long way politically. People will probably, like that in the end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the task force, it has been created, and there are details coming out actually just recently about what it looks like. So the executive order was signed in February, but now, just looking at an article published in Politico this month on the 11th, now that task force is starting to actually do stuff. So here's what's happening on the ground. Here's how Trump is keeping you safe from Biden's weaponization of anti-Christian bias. So it was sent around by Marco Rubio. First of all, this kind of cable announcing that this policy would be in effect. And it says that the task force is going to meet on April 22nd. So it's coming right up to discuss the initial findings of reports basically made by employees tattling on each other about anti-Christian bias. The cable says that reports should be as detailed as possible, including names, dates, locations, like the post or domestic office where the incident occurred. And so they want you to tell them, they want state employees to tell the government who is being mean to Christians. And then on the 22nd, they're going to look at all those reports and they're going to figure out what to do about it. As you can imagine, that doesn't sit well with people who actually work for the government. And so there's some comments in here, different kinds of pieces. But one of the big ones is that it is creating a kind of culture of fear or anxiety because the government is literally telling you to, like, it's empowering like the most annoying person in your office to basically like have free reign to like get you in trouble for saying that you don't like VeggieTales. That's basically what's going on here.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's never been more important to organize a union where you work. I mean, a lot of state employees have unions, so that's great. Already, but oh man, you gotta get out there. You gotta protect yourself, and a union's the only way you can do that. And part of that process of organizing a union is mapping out your workplace and learning who's cool and who's not. So a great time to start flexing those muscles. And Randy from accounting, you shouldn't tell him anything. If he talks to you about VeggieTales, you just say, "Oh, yep, I love those. I love that tomato. I love that guy." It's so stupid.
Yeah.
It is like the analysis I have is just, it's pretty fascist if you think about it. It's pretty fascist to do that. It's bad. It's bad to drive a wedge between people like that, I think. Sowing disharmony in the workplace. No, that's bad. The HR department will hate that. But also it's like, it is a hinge to start taking other types of action and, marginalizing other types of people, right? It's people who aren't Christians, I think, and people who are Christians but aren't like that kind of Christian. I am perversely interested in seeing how some of this will actually play out amongst like the swaths of sort of religious activists in the US who don't like this kind of thing,
Hmm.
like I just wonder like what will become of, and like how like the Poor People's Campaign or whatever will be painted within this sort of like paradigm of weird right-wing sort of grievance culture Christianity. I mean, others too, for sure, but they're just a really public one. It'll be horrifying and probably bad to see what happens.
Yeah, I think so. I think also, well, two things that came to mind as you were saying. One is like on the workplace side, a lot of these, if they're like public employees, will already have a union, or at least it will affect unionized employees. And
Yeah.
I guess it's a challenge to the labor movement to be like, I don't know, how do you fight back against something like that? Maybe in some
Yep.
ways you kind of can't, but maybe you have to. Like, we haven't really seen a wave of like strikes among the bureaucracy, which I think is interesting. That is how oftentimes civil servants respond to left wing governments, unfortunately, by going on strike. And they're not doing that now. So I don't know. We'll see how that goes. The other thing that came to mind for me is the big question will be what happens after this meeting on the 22nd, where they get these reports, if there are any, and they look at them and they're like, here's the anti-Christian bias happening at whatever, the Department of Education or something. And what happens to that? Like, how do they interpret what is and isn't Christian? For example, if someone says that, like, I don't know, some piece of like sex ed should be included in the curriculum, is that construed as, anti-Christian bias? If someone suggests in a history class that, I don't know, like like a lot of slaveholders were Christians and that's bad, like, is that anti-Christian bias? I think that it kind of opens up an opportunity for the
Yeah.
government to continue, disciplining um, apparatuses of the state, but under the auspices that they're not Christian enough. And it is really fascinating. Like, Karl Marx had this really wild essay on the Jewish question. It's very complicated, lots of controversy around it, whether it is or isn't anti-Semitic. I don't know. You can read a million essays and figure it out for yourself. But one thing that he says in it, he's talking about socialism and freedom of religion. And he says the separation of church and state, people think that it will mean the disappearance of religion. But in fact, in the United States, he says, already in the 1800s, they did it. They separated church and state, and that country is full of religion. And apparently, that's not a big deal. And I think that one thing that Marx also identifies in it is that the U.S. remains like an incredibly Christian nation, despite the fact that it doesn't have a state church. And he's saying it kind of in part to, like, I guess, argue against critics that socialism is trying to, like, I don't know, destroy your ability to pray or something. But he's also saying it in a critical way to be like, these things are infrastructural, like Christianity is infrastructural to our even secular states and societies. And man, you just see that point, like, kind of reach a fever pitch with something like this. Like, we have a
Yeah.
separation of church and state, but we have like an absolute government of total Christianity right now, right? Like, it is a just severely Christian government, like a negatively, violently Christian government. And that is such a bizarre, like, manifestation of a state in history. Like, I don't think there's any other state you can point to historically that is moving with a kind of like Christian disciplinarianism in the way that it is in the US. There's forms of Catholic fascism, obviously. Maybe the closest thing would be like Rios Montt in Guatemala, who we've talked about in the show in the past. But there's still nothing quite as like bizarre as the attempt to, like, on the one hand, affirm that the US is not a strictly Christian nation, but also, like, they're not even setting up like a task force to eradicate anti-Semitism, for example. Like, it's a really bizarre sort of government strategy.
Yeah, it is. I mean, the anti-Semitism stuff actually comes into play in some weird ways within this conversation, but that's probably another podcast episode, for sure. Something I find really interesting about that about that thing you just said, total Christianity. That sounds like a Paul Virilio book, but, but maybe not yet. Something that's really interesting about that whole idea, though, is that there is a total Christianity, a disciplinary Christian sort of thing going on within the U.S. government, but also, like, it is so vibes based. It is like there isn't a state church. There's not like an orthodoxy that they can point to besides just kind of like what they think is orthodox. But the orthodoxy is just grievance. It's just grievances that people have against trans people and against like I don't know, perceived attacks on traditional religion or whatever. And I think that's like such a such a weird part of it. The referent is completely floating. It's nothing. It's just out there, and it's whatever is, you know, kind of pumped in and defined, which makes it so bizarre. I you know, I think about all of those types of like surveys that came out, I don't know, in years past. Maybe I'll find some of them and link them in or whatever. But you know, like the declining rates of church attendance among evangelicals, or declining rates of like actual orthodox theology amongst evangelicals or something. But it's such a weird phenomena that like what evangelical Christianity like actually is in practice is sort of this amorphous blob of things that has no real fixity, I think. You know, there are some things that are fixed, like grievances, but like the disciplinary state that's kind of coming alongside and out of it has sort of like, you know, is just kind of defining things generally and vaguely. It's just such a weird blob of problems and beliefs that are incoherent and at odds with one another, historically and, you know, theologically for sure. But just like even just like confused ideas, I guess, is all I'm trying to say this is. And that's the weirdest part of it all. There's like it's not like the Spanish Inquisition, right? It's not like there's like there's not like a church that's going to lock you in a dungeon because you are not a papist or something. There's just like, I don't know, if you just don't quite meet the vibe check of this whole thing, then you're in trouble. It's just such a weird orthodoxy to impose on people.
Yeah. I mean, and I think that, I mean, it is confused in great detail, obviously. That's true. It's a confused and amorphous set of grievances and frustrations. I think that's right. But I think something that is really fascinating is there's a kind of Catholic persecution complex in it that feels a bit unique and new and almost like uniquely identified. And that's really fascinating because there has been this trend of like Catholic support for far right politics in the US over the last many years. And, you know, I think that's intriguing from a US history perspective. The only two Catholic presidents in U.S. history have been JFK and Biden, two Catholic Democrats. And Vance, of course, is vice president. And there's this kind of real shift of like, I don't know, political identity among U.S. Catholics. So that's really fascinating. But the other piece that I find interesting is, so it's true, it's a bit amorphous, but there was a article in The Conversation earlier this month talking about how the kind of anti-Christian bias sort of ends up also being a stand-in for race and not just religion. Right. And I think that seems really true, right? It's really about bias against white people on the whole and kind of overwhelmingly white forms of Christianity. And even the persecution complex mirrors the kinds of like right-wing anxieties around, I don't know, white people being discriminated against in their society, you know, in these really weird ways. And this is the kind of like Christianization of that same white anxiety. And that seems interesting to me too, because the amorphousness of Christianity is really reflective of the fact that underneath it, there is this like ongoing determinate anxiety of, you know, white people in general. And that's the thing that gives it maybe a form of unity. Like there's a particular group and class and race of people who have been in power for a long time. And I don't know, this is just like one more way of expressing their fear of losing that position in society.
Yeah. That article from the Conversation is quite interesting. We don't really have time to get into it all, but I'll link it in the show notes so you can take a look at it if you want, though. But the conclusion of that article is that like through a bunch of sort of like psychological and sort of social science polling that this the author of the article did, that like basically white Christians linked anti-Christian bias to anti-white bias. And just like you're saying, there's like a lot of anxiety there where some of this is like some of the grievances that you see kind of erupting in these spaces that are even identified in the executive order are like adjacent, if not directly tied to like Great Replacement types of like conspiracy theories and stuff. You know, there's a lot of that going on there. So yeah, I mean that is a great point. That the specific beliefs might be amorphous, but there is sort of an underlying white supremacist idea to some of this. That's a great point. There is something really weird about the Catholic part of this though, because there is like a real centering of Catholic persecution in this, which is I think actually pretty fascinating to see because I mean I don't know, there are plenty of evangelical like anti-abortion protesters out there in the world that are I'm sure just as wild as the people that you know were cited within the executive order or whatever. There's something going on, I think, within the Trump situation and Catholicism that I think is maybe underexplored. I mean, the evangelical connection is like clear. That is an easy one to trace, but like the Catholic one is a little bit more interesting. I mean, so this executive order is kind of cashing in on some of that. But I was thinking even back to like when he was on the campaign trail and he would play like the Ave Maria or whatever and just kind of like sway to it on stage. Like there's something there's something going on there, and I don't know exactly what it is. Trump likes Catholicism like aesthetically or something. Like there's something about that he's like really into. I can't exactly tell, but yeah,
there's more gold.
Bizarre. Yeah, that's true. A lot more gold.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, there has been, I think like Catholic journalists have been following that story for a while, which has been interesting, but it is not, I guess it's not as familiar as the story of evangelical right-wing politics. Yeah. So maybe it just, you know, it seems more surprising because, well, it is a somewhat newer phenomenon in the mainstream. Maybe to bring the conversation home, though, one thing that we mentioned at the top of the show that is maybe a good place to land is, so you have this executive order articulating an anxiety about persecuting Christians and the state in particular persecuting Christians. And while they're wrong about the contours of that, I think we've talked about, I think we might even have done a whole episode on the show in the past on this, but there is something to the important claim that the US government does actually target and persecute Christians for their faith. If we understand your faith as not being like neatly carved up between religious and secular, you know, identities or activities. So what I mean by that is like, you know, the overwhelming mass of people who are being deported from the US right now are Christians of some kind or other, right? Like they're migrants from Latin America. There was just a report a couple of days ago, even I think now, that a bunch of Afghan Christians who are legally in the US are receiving all these letters that they had to get out of the United States by Good Friday. Which also there were a ton of Iraqi Christians who were deported in Trump's first term. And I mean, these are Christians who are being persecuted by the government, not for their faith per se, but, you know, whatever. They're Christians being disciplined by the state in the same way that some of these other examples cited in the executive order were Christians being disciplined by the state. And also more kind of directly tied here, the state has been trying to kind of pull the rug out from Christians who are trying to organize for solidarity among immigrants, refugees, migrants, etc. That truly is a kind of anti-Christian persecution, being like, you can't exercise that part of your faith. And I think you see the same thing too in like the kind of support the US government lends to literally persecution-driven governments. You know, I'm thinking of like Modi in India, who's kind of Hindutva is persecuting Christians, or, you know, the state of Israel, which is like bombing Christians in Palestine or rounding them up in the West Bank and so on. So, you know, like these are governments that literally persecute Christians, and the US is promoting them, boosting them, trying to build a relationship with them, etc. And it's not only in times of Trumpism, you know, like you could look at, I don't know, the way that the US government funded or supported or trained the assassins of Oscar Romero, or disciplined liberation theology in Latin America, right? All these examples of Christians being disciplined by the state. And I think that is actually the interesting untold story here, that underneath the persecution anxiety of right-wing Christians, there is like an actual persecution of Christians that we could be mad about. But because liberals are also involved in that persecution, we don't we don't understand it that way, or don't put it in those terms. So I don't know, maybe we have to rescue the language of Christian persecution, but in the right way.
Yeah, I think that's right. Whenever people talk about Christian persecution, they always mean, you know, a type of conservative Christian, and never sort of anything else with, like never anything with regard to solidarity or sort of like more left leaning types of Christians organizing or whatever. I remember we had this conversation. I don't know who can say exactly when, but there were a few episodes we did about the DPRK. I don't know, like hundreds of years ago, probably. who can say when it was? But we talked about the ways even that the United States government, bombed every church, right? Like people wonder like what happened to religion and the DPRK. It still exists for sure, but like the United States bombed all the churches. I don't know. That's persecution. Maybe not because they're Christians, because they're communists, something else. I don't know. But the United States does not care about religion, and it never really has. When it comes to exercising power and disciplining their enemies, it does not. It's not a difference that makes a difference for anybody in the government. Yeah.
Yeah, it is not looking good. The U.S., when you look at actual Christians who are being harmed around the world, truly not a defender of religious freedom, I guess, is how we could put it. I guess all that to say, so going back to Judith Butler's point about the fact that we need to kind of examine these executive orders in detail, I think the value of doing that is to be like, the Trump administration is trying to define what Christianity is and isn't, and also what state discipline of Christianity is and isn't. And in some ways, they are doing that in ways that, as we talked about with Jessica Reznicek, if they really followed the logic of what they were after, you'd be opening the door to like Christians doing all kinds of civil disobedience, which they have historically been known to do, and seeing that as Christian persecution. But of course, they'll never do that. And so it's ultimately the kind of, it seems like, the legal articulation that if you are a right-wing Christian, even a fascist right-wing Christian, there is literally nothing you could ever do that would be wrong or that would warrant the kind of like intervention by the state to stop it or like pen you in. You would simply be exercising your faith if you decided that, I don't know, Hitler did nothing wrong and you'll still go to mass and say that there, right? Like that would be totally fine. And I think that is actually a really important development to track and something that we'll have to see how it materializes into like actual disciplinary structures as they translate that persecution complex outward, like you mentioned earlier, Matt.
Yeah, that sounds good. I really like this Judith Butler idea, though. I think that's such a powerful tool and a challenging tool. I mean, there's like you were saying earlier, that there's just like so much executive order stuff. The zone is flooded for sure. But I think something maybe to add. I've not read the Judith Butler piece, so maybe they've already said this, but it is the work of the movement, in this moment to like actually do this, and not any one person's job. I think is maybe something else too. That saying that out loud makes me feel less anxious about it, knowing that like I've done this piece. Somebody else can jump in with something else maybe, and other people are for sure. Like, not saying that nobody's doing this work, but that it's up to all of us to kind of start to keep parsing this out and figure out what's going on.
Yeah. And I think that's Butler's point too, as they say, it has to be a kind of public process, right? Of like pulling these things apart so that we can all see them, like looking under the hood and being like, what's really going on here? And I think it's a call for more and more folks to like take on the burden of actually wading through all the bullshit that the Trump administration is trying to throw.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard, you can support us on Patreon, patreon.com/the Magnificast. If you join the Patreon, you can sometimes get an early episode every now and again. I'm not promising anything more than just every now and again. Editing these is so time consuming. You wouldn't guess that because of the way they sound, but they do take a little bit of time.
We only have Matt GPT over here, and he requires sleep and food. So
that's true. Yeah, that's true. I do a lot of both of those things. If you support us, though, you also get an invite to our cool behind the paywall Discord channel where we hang out and have, I don't know, conversations about what we made for dinner and share our pictures of pets and birds.
A lot of good Easter pictures in there right now.
Yeah, big time. Yeah, lots of good Easter stuff. Great Easter content. We've been sharing a lot of Easter memes, so that's cool. You could be a part of that. So that's a bad pitch. The rest of it is good, but the memes are bad. Can't do anything about that. Anyways, you should join. It'd be great to have you there. Our intro music is by Amari Armstrong, and our outro music is by The Illogical Spoon, and we'll see you next week.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored. Don't worry, someday there'll be no dam between us and our Lord. Jackson, keep your hoods up. Keep your hoods up and you stay up late. In Jackson, you keep your hoods up. Well, you keep your hoods up and you stay up late. Oh, don't mind a cold night, but we might mind if you leave too soon. So come on now, it's still early. Beside, what else are you gonna do? As we kissed in the alley by the Michigan Theater, fall snow was glowing in the lights of the downtown. Saw a spark in your eyes, I just spoke it. Said we're gonna turn this whole place upside down. Then you said, my dear, do you really mean this? I said, I only know what I feel right now. I said,